This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with war and terror and fear in Iraq, in Syria, and of course in Gaza, with economic insecurity plaguing American families and the political discourse as debased as ever, one might wonder why I would have devoted this week so much attention to a New York Times columnist named Thomas Friedman. I have already, let's say, dissected Mr. Friedman before on the pages of Salon.com, and I went back and did it again. And you might ask yourself, why? I certainly did, but it's important. Why is it important to talk about what's wrong with Tom Friedman and his writing? Well, one answer to that is emotional. The violations of decency in his writing have just become too great, and it just makes the soul cry out, "Dear Lord, will this man never stop?" His latest outrage was a column about the nation of Madagascar titled Maybe in America. That was the title. Where did that title come from? Don't even ask. We don't even want to go there. But Maybe in America is, as a column, a distillation of Tom Friedman in its purest form. In a sense, they made an artificial Tom Friedman column generator, which I write about in the piece, where you can it'll just plug in all the cliches that he relies on to talk about the world is flat and to sell his vision of globalization, a highly destructive economic vision, but to gloss it up and make it sound fun. So you can go check out the automatic Tom Friedman column generator, but you don't even need it anymore because he's become the column generator himself, or he's outsourced himself to some automated machine in the cloud. I mean, really, what human being would write these words? And I quote from Tom Friedman: "It's not easy being a country anymore. There is no more Cold War to prop up, arm and finance frail states. More important, the combined pressure of the market, parentheses, globalization, and the speed with which investment can flow into countries doing the right things and out of those doing bad things, end parentheses, Moore's Law, new parentheses, the steady rise in computing power that makes every good job today require more education, end parentheses, and Mother Nature, new parentheses, climate change, biodiversity loss, erosion, and population growth, end parentheses, have all passed certain tipping points," end quote. To which every sentient flesh and blood creature on the planet can only respond, "Say what? What did you just say?" Now, I guess maybe the reason why I can decode Tom Friedman is because I used to live in the business world where consultants are apt to throw out BS like that all the time when they're really just trying to sell you on a product or more of their services. Otherwise, it just looks like a lightly tossed salad of half-baked julie-end ideas, which it is too. So let's try to decode it a little bit. Let's start with, it's not easy being a country anymore. Yes, Tom Friedman wrote, "It's not easy being a country anymore." I get, like he knows, but dear Lord, is Tom Friedman and his ilk now more capable of empathy toward a country, which is just an arbitrary product of armed conflict, geography, economy, and law, than he and his ilk are toward their fellow human beings? The answer appears to be yes, because the rest of the column seems to lament the great numbers of Madagascar's citizens. We're told there are far too many of them, and the environmental damage they're causing, without one time expressing direct concern for the fact that they're living in some of the worst poverty on Earth. Friedman writes, quote, "You see a giant red plume of eroded red soil bleeding into," I don't know why he used red twice in that sense, but bleeding into the Betsiboka River, bleeding into the Mahajanga Bay, bleeding into the Indian Ocean. The mess is so big that astronauts take pictures of it from space. Now, yes, it's a mess, and yes, it's red. Okay, Tom, we got that part. But the question is, what are we going to do about the extreme poverty of the people who live in Madagascar? Tom Friedman's only suggestion, eco-tourist lodges. That is not going to keep 20 plus million people out of poverty, but that's the best he's got, because Tom Friedman and his ilk don't want to talk about the globalization, the global economic policies, and the global financial system that put those people in poverty to begin with, going back to the days of colonialism and coming forward to the present day and into the future. They don't want to talk about that because that violates the system that makes them wealthy, feeds them, makes them popular, and lionizes them. But that's what we're here to talk about on the Zero Hour. Now, Tom Friedman tells us there'll be more of his writing on this topic in the months and years to come, and we believe him. I think he will keep writing on it till it is a giant plume of eroded red literature bleeding into the Betsaboka River, bleeding into Mahajanga Bay, bleeding into the Indian Ocean. Tom Friedman will keep writing until astronauts take pictures of his writing from outer space. But we on the Zero Hour will be here to tell you what's really going on in the world, here in the United States, all around the planet, and what we need to do about it. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with us now, it's our great pleasure to welcome Rick Perlstein, who is an American historian, a journalist, a writer. He's written for The Village Voice, The New Republic, Mother Jones and the Nation. Years ago, he was a senior fellow and writer with the Campaign for America's Future, which is the other hat I also wear as well. He has written a lot of very important history books recently, including Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, Nixon Land, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America, and most recently, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, which is going to be our primary topic today. Rick, thanks so much for joining us.
You forgot to mention friend, RJ.
I assumed that was obvious, but absolutely, friend. And we're delighted to have you. And Rick, I wanted to start with a quick anecdote just to set up why I've been so impressed with The Invisible Bridge. I'm sadly old enough to remember the fall of Nixon and the rise of Reagan, although I was a kid. But, you know, to some of us, that's like the fall of Dr. Doom and the rise of Galactus or something. But I think your book takes a very neutral tone, and despite that, a very objective, authorly tone. Despite that, has set off a bit of a firestorm, which we may get to. But the anecdote I wanted to tell you is this: in 1988, as the Reagan presidency was coming to an end, and I was a young corporate executive of all things, I was sitting in a hotel room watching reruns of a program called Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which you're no doubt aware of. And that was in 1968, supposed to capitalize. It was a couple Las Vegas comedians trying to capitalize on the counterculture with a kind of hippie-ish
I've always wondered
vibe.
who Rowan and Martin were, actually.
They were Las Vegas strip comedians, basically. They were Rat Pack wannabes. And and their bit was going to be, hey, we'll do the hippies. We'll do the hippies on TV.
It was kind of like the monkeys of comedy.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And so their show was a big hit, and they used to have a bit every week called "The News 20 Years from Today," and it would be gag news about the wacky things America's going to be doing 20 years from today. And so this show was made when Ronald Reagan was first running for governor of California, and people thought that was a joke. He was a has-been. He was a nobody. He had been the host of Borax Theater or one of those things, a TV show where he'd advertise 20 Mule Team Borax. I mean, he was a nobody and a laugh line. And when the News of the Future bit began, he opened with the line, and in news from 20 years from today, President Ronald Reagan announced, and then cue the laugh track.
In other words, kidding me. I am so mad at you, RJ. Why did you not tell me about this? I could have put that in the book. I got to put it in my next book. It's great.
Isn't it amazing? So there I was in 1988 realizing, watching the tributes to this so-called wonderful president, certainly transformative president in many ways, and wondering to myself, how in 20 years did this man go from being a punchline, even for Vegas comedians, to the historical figure he became? And a lot of the answer to that, in my opinion, is in your book, The Invisible Bridge. And I wanted to talk to you about that. The sense I get reading your book is that more than anything else, Reagan became Reagan because of, first of all, as you say, we suffered more wounds. This is you writing. Between 1973 and 1976, America suffered more wounds to its ideal of itself than at just about any other time in history, meaning the withdrawal from Vietnam, Watergate, Nixon resignation, and so on. With these traumas emerge a new sort of American politics, a stark discourse of reckoning. And then in comes Reagan with no doubt, no question, no hesitation, telling a narrative of purity and idealism that resonated. And where the hell did this guy come from?
Right. I mean, people who've read my books, my previous books, know I put some stock in kind of psychology and understanding history. And it's not even just really the psychology of the guy who becomes the president, even though that's interesting enough. It's not psychobiography. What's really interesting is when sort of a leader's deepest, or an aspirant for leadership, deepest psychological drives resonate with the collective longings of the mass public, right? And that's what's happening with Reagan. That's what happened with Nixon. I think his kind of sadism and his sense that the whole world was out to get him, and that liberals were snobs and they were out-of-touch bureaucrats. This is the Franklin Orthogonian thing I write about in Nixonland, is a big part of his appeal. Reagan comes from a chaotic family. His dad's an alcoholic. He's basically a failed shoe salesman. Bad enough to be a shoe salesman, but a failed shoe salesman, right? And right. He's always moving the family from town to town, probably, one step ahead of the law. It's prohibition. He could be showing up in the newspaper any day. The reason I'm convinced that he hasn't turned up in the Dixon Telegraph for a drunkenness arrest was because he was a pinnacle partner of the sheriff. And his mom, what she contributes to this is she's kind of a do-gooder and a martyr. And she's constantly kind of like on the road around the region, helping people in need, which is noble enough. But she's also, kind of reading the Bible to prisoners and playing her mandolin for the prisoners. I think she had a mandolin and a banjo. And she was so kind of respected as a kind of someone said she was a faith healer too, actually. She was so kind of respected for doing this in the community that prisoners were, kind of after finishing their sentences would literally be remanded to her custody and stay in the family sewing room. But while they're staying in the family sewing room, Reagan and his brother are sleeping two to a bed. And there's this great line I quote in the book about, just what kind of weird family was this where you have this kind of fundamentalist mom, this kind of Catholic drunk dad, you have this succession of prisoners coming in and out, and what was it like for a kid to grow up in that situation? If you look at the pictures of Reagan when he was there are not many of them, but when he was kind of 7, 8, 9, no one knew he was going to be great, so, there wasn't a lot of photography, and of course he was not a rich kid. He looks like what he really was, which was a kind of a lost, scared kid. Mm. But if you look at the pictures of him after that, you can't find a single one in which he doesn't have that kind of sense of inner grace that we associate with Ronald Reagan. Always aware of the camera, always kind of posing, but always sort of looking confident, solid, someone you'd want to follow into battle, right? And so what happened in the interim? What's that, RJ? What were we going to say?
Well, what I was going to say was the cheap interpretation would be that but possibly with some validity, would be that, here you had a nation that was undergoing its own trauma for years, in the years leading up to Reagan's election. I mean, you quoted a headline about, I think, the return of the POWs. Nation's hunger to feel good erupts in fever of patriotism. One of the great quotes. People don't realize.
Is cheap, RJ?
No, I'm saying my interpretation is cheap,
That's
and
my
I was going to.
Too. Basically, it's like basically there's this, what he's providing to. So what he comes out of, kind of basically reading, boys' adventure books and kind of identifying with sports heroes is this kind of inner transformation in which he kind of makes himself the hero of his own adventure story and a rescuer. And that's kind of the role he's cast himself in everywhere, and he's really, really, really good at it. And of course, ever since the beginning, some people think he's a phony and some people think he's a hero, right? But, when you get to the 70s, when some people think he's a phony and some people think he's a hero, his ability to kind of, sort of address what's going on, the chaos, but respond with this stout-hearted certainty that it's not really chaotic at all. Other people might think it's chaotic, but actually he sees this crystalline moral clarity. And how you manage to do that, in the face of something like the Vietnam War, I mean, that's some pretty virtuoso stuff.
Well, and it certainly is, and he morphed a little bit. I mean, I think when he was governor, for example, I remember him being extremely nasty about student demonstrators and poor people. So he had this nasty streak, but he had this sunniness. Yeah. So I guess what I wanted to ask you about as a historian, you have what used to be called in the before feminism, the great man theory of history that says, one transformative figure, and you talk about this, one transformative figure comes along. Then you have a theory that says, no, the individuals don't matter. It's the shifting tides of history. But I think it feels as if one of your conclusions, I don't want to speak for you, but one of the conclusions to be drawn from The Invisible Bridge in the Reagan story is that it's a co-authorship between the talented individual and history or society. Is that fair?
Absolutely. The great leader kind of rides sort of the tide of the interchange of the electorate, right? And there's this guy actually who writes a lot about this. There's a whole very dense and very thoughtful book called Leadership by this guy John McGregor Burns, who just died about a month ago. He was a FDR biographer, this great political scientist, right? And we could spend a lot of time sitting around a dinner table theorizing about Barack Obama's rise in exactly the same way. This guy who can kind of reconcile and unite all opposites, who can, who's, kind of palpable longing for kind of stability and safety and security in this kind of fatherless, kind of strange, cosmopolitan, multicultural upbringing, kind of heals the wounds of a country that just feels too divided for words, right? It's a good way to think about history, and, obviously if it's not abused, but really it's just, the foundation for kind of telling a story about how social change happens. And you can watch it happening. You can watch debates. Yeah.
And that's something that I want to get into a little. We're going to take a quick break if that's okay, but that's something I want to get into a little bit more, and maybe a little bit about why pundits got it so wrong at the time, which is something that you talk about in The Invisible Bridge. So we will be right back after this break. We're talking with historian and author Rick Perlstein about his new book, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we'll be right back after this. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we're speaking with Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, and author of the new book, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. And I wanted to ask you, Rick, we've been talking about how, in the last segment, we talked about how Ronald Reagan kind of captured a moment, a zeitgeist. And, it's important to remember that societies aren't homogenous, and there were a lot of people who didn't feel the Reagan magic. Myself among them at the time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about punditry, because you write, a central theme of my previous two books, chronicling conservatism's ascendancy in American politics, has been the myopia of pundits who so frequently fail to notice the very cultural ground shifting beneath their feet. Now, pundits made fun of Ronald Reagan, I would say. People may not like this, but he's I would consider Reagan a living embodiment of that liberal aphorism, that quote that gets attributed to various folks about first they make fun of you and then they ignore you and then you win, or whatever it is. I mean, they made fun of Reagan and ignored him and dismissed him for years, didn't they?
Unfortunately. Yeah, absolutely. RJ, I'm on a book tour and I've been doing so many interviews. Did I tell you the story about Lassie? Oh, yeah, no, I didn't. That was another interview. When he ran for governor in 1966 and he won the nomination, Esquire said, well, the Republican Party in California is not that hard up. They didn't nominate Liberace.
Right.
I mean, this is a guy who was, who co-starred with a chimp. This is hilarious, right? And, like you said, like the the laugh-in thing. Actually, this is a true story. Someone told me that she was working at a nursing home, and someone had dementia, and they told her that Ronald Reagan was president, and she couldn't stop laughing. And she was like, her head was in, whatever it was, 1948, and she thought that was the most hilarious thing she'd ever heard. So it comes naturally, but so they're always dismissing him, and kind of fast forwarding to 1980. The Carter administration's strategy is to get Ronald Reagan into a debate, because they know if the president of the United States and this extremist actor just kind of stand side by side, Reagan will look like a fool. He'll say something crazy or stupid. He'll say we begin bombing in 5 minutes or whatever, and then I've talked to Carter speechwriters, and they're like, we just knew, we'd done the opposition research. Once we hit him with this, he had, said that, Medicare was going to turn us all into slaves of the federal government. How could he possibly win? So even the smartest and most sophisticated people at the highest level of the game are playing this. And you know what happened? I mean, they had a debate on October 27th, 1980, the week before the election, and Reagan didn't drool. And when he was hit with the, this line that was supposed to be the haymaker about him, saying that that Medicare was going to turn us all into slaves of the government, he had all through the debate hit Carter for supposedly distorting his record, and he just kind of giggled. He kind of smirked. He can smirk. Smirk would look ugly. He giggled. He looked at the audience and said, "There you go again," and the audience laughed in sympathy with him, and it was just Carter was completely caught flat-footed. No one seemed to figure out that you never underestimate this guy, because he'll always smack you in the end.
Well, wasn't that also the debate where they had somehow acquired, perhaps with quotation marks around the word acquired, Carter's debating book and knew what he was going to go for?
Well, there you go again. Another liberal insisting that it must be some trick that Ronald Reagan was able to, beat anybody. Yeah, that happened. George Will was
there you
was,
go
was
again,
right?
Yeah.
But look, he didn't need it. He didn't need a like a secret kind of briefing book about Carter to win a debate. He was winning. He beat it. Go on YouTube and check out the debate he did with RFK in 1967. He kicked his butt.
Really?
This guy is really fast on his feet and verbally fluid, but it's also that blitheness, that ability to kind of reduce complexities into incredibly witty sound bites. That it's catnip. It's remarkable.
Well, and there's another piece of Reagan too that I think is very interesting, which is, and you're a musician, I'm a musician, which is his tone of voice was so brilliantly modulated that he could say outrageous things, but he would say them, well, that's just the way it is. And you just thought, well, I'm just talking to a regular, plain-speaking guy, not one of these politicians. So when he tells me Medicare has made a slave of me, well, I just can't help it. There was something so soothing about the way he would intonate the madness, right?
Yeah.
So
and apparently he got his tone of voice from studying his mother, who was apparently very effective rhetorician in church. Yeah.
And I as someone who plays, by the way, plays mandolin and a little banjo. They're not my main instruments, but I'd be very, very, and collects old songs. I'd be very curious. I'd love to know her repertoire.
Well, I know she did some dialect comedy. Seriously.
Oh boy.
And there's what is the story? It's in the book somewhere, or maybe I didn't put it in the book. But there's like a famous kind of Yiddish dialect story about something at Sadie at the wedding or something like that, and it's famous. There's a record of it, and it actually found it on YouTube, and I think I put it on Facebook once. But that's the kind of stuff, it was like Boardwalk Empire. It was like the popular culture of the 20s. I'm sure that that was what was in the air. It was kind of the great era of mass culture, right? It'd be fascinating.
Right, and probably some Stephen Foster and all of that stuff too.
Mm-hmm. And he could tell dialect stories too. Robert Novak, on a plane trip with him in 1976, that he told kind of like he did like perfect ethnic dialect, and said, my aides won't let me do this in public.
That was good advice.
Yeah, right.
Well, listen, Again, I want to let the audience know that The Invisible Bridge by Rick Perlstein, it's such a terrific book. I mean, it's so well written. There's so much in there. I think it's so clear. But originally, when we booked you for the show, I was going to ask you more about this, these claims being made against you, this absurd perjury and all that from a Republican hack. But that's already imploded. I'm sorry, not perjury. Plagiarism.
I mean, they might, they might have me, kidnapping the Lindenberg baby next. Who knows?
Forgive me for conflating those two words, but I just finished a piece about Wall Street, so it was an understandable mistake. So forgive me. But plagiarism, which was just a ridiculous charge, and I was going to ask you more about it, but it's already in 48 hours imploded and fallen apart. But so the real question is not the substance of this silly, accusation from whatever he is, Ann Coulter's flack or whatever he does for a living. But the real question is, why do you think this book has touched such a nerve? I mean, Nixon Land, a couple conservatives, I don't know if it was who it was, George F. Will or somebody thought it was a good book. It was because you're a historian, right? So you should be able to respect the telling of history. But something about this book, The Fall of Nixon and Rise of Reagan, it's touched off a nerve, and they really wanted to discredit it before it even got into the bookstores and maybe prevent it from getting into the bookstores. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, the question answers itself. I mean, he really is a larger-than-life god to these guys. And, I think that the guy who's plagiarizing me, Craig Shirley, accusing me of plagiarism, he's a good historian, and his book is good, which is why I cited it 125 times. I like to say, he wants my book pulped, I want his book read. I'm trying to start a conversation, he's trying to stop a conversation. But, he's not, there are flaws in his book, and he kind of passes off some mythology as fact, right? And there's this really great example to kind of give away the end of the book. Reagan gives this very famous speech in the 1976 convention. Ford wins. It's close. But Ford, at the end, kind of, after he gives this acceptance speech, kind of calls up to Ronald Reagan, who's in the rafters, and begs him to come down and say a few words. And Reagan kind of shakes his head, no, and says, this is, Ford's movement, and he looks really, really reluctant. Finally, he accedes to the cheers of the crowd, and he makes his way down to the stage, and he supposedly tells an aide, I have no idea what I'm going to say, and gives this amazing address that basically has the delegates crying, and, once again saying, well, maybe we nominated the wrong guy. Now, Craig Shirley takes this story at face value, but both of us read, and I know this because Shirley, and when we were kind of having cordial conversations on the phone, both of us read, and he claims to have enjoyed a 1977 book that completely debunks that story and proves that the Reagan and the Ford forces had kind of negotiated every aspect of that script. And in his interview with Dave Weigel in Slate, as an example of why I'm a bad historian, he says, how can he, say that, this was not spontaneous? If you watch the video on YouTube, you can see him shaking his head that he doesn't want to do it.
Oh, well, then it must be.
So he can't even, sort of wrap his mind around the fact that Reagan was, a skilled actor, and might even say it ain't so, have attempted a little bit of subterfuge here and again.
So, or perhaps theater. And by the way, I think his reaction to losing his legs in King's Row was also completely authentic. So we've got this character rising on it. So I guess just to close off the punditry and the pushback piece on it. So basically, they really need Reagan to be this magical figure, this transformative.
Yeah, even though he wasn't all that popular when he was president.
Nor, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but nor I think was he the most popular ex-president when he and Bill Clinton were both former presidents.
Well, probably Jimmy Carter's the most popular ex-president. That's a different story altogether. Yeah.
And I guess my only point in saying that is that, this is how I'm going to circle back to the media, but the media have been, I think, very complicit in this sense, particularly at the time of Reagan's funeral and so on, that Reagan was the most popular president in modern history, that he that he was considered an iconic figure after his presidency and on the mold of FDR, when really he was not that popular as a president, and a lot of people didn't think much of him when he was a former president. Is that fair? Isn't that
figure? I mean, the truth.
Yeah,
it's like you can interpret anything about the president, whether it was good or bad, right? And I accept that, but it's simply a fact of history that Reagan is a very divisive figure. And even, Edmund Morris. I mean, I thought, on the book tour, I thought I'd be talking a lot about Edmund Morris, but people seem to have forgotten him. Edmund Morris treats him like everyone loved him, and he was this beloved, great guy.
Edmund Morris, of course, who wrote the famous. It was his book was Dutch, right?
Dutch, the one where he, proudly made stuff up.
Right. He had been reading too much. Who are the guys who did the original New Journalism, fictionalizing and
right?
And so he, So he was doing a lot of mythological or fictionalized
he wrote
conversation.
Himself into the story and pretended that he had gone to school with Ronald Reagan, and it was fictionalized. Weird.
Yeah, it was weird, and I think that was the reason why people couldn't embrace it. But how was his research? Was it any good?
In some ways it was good, in some ways it was bad, but he kind of broke faith with the reader, and that one of the things I'm really proud of is I quote these interviews a guy did in 1966 that he sent me with Reagan's college classmates, and I was like, have people used these before? This is amazing. And one of the things I show is that kind of Reagan divided friend and foe in exactly the same way when he was in college that he does now. And the guy said,
about that. Go ahead.
Edmund Morris, he said, they're in Edmund Morris's book, but if you look at the footnotes, you can't tell whether he's making it up or not. So, I mean, it's like, there's a really, my favorite piece of fictionalized history, or kind of halfway between fictionalized history and historical novel writing, is a really good book about the Soviet Union called Red Plenty. But the author of that, Anthony Spooford, his footnotes are very explicit about what he makes up and what he doesn't make up. So that didn't happen with Edmund Morris, and I think that's a little nuts. It's pretty unacceptable.
Well, maybe he wanted to make himself an elusive figure so that he couldn't be pinned down and attacked by anybody. Maybe it was
actually that's exactly what I argued in a Newsweek essay. That basically,
really,
the character Edmund Morris is a racist. Who called James Baldwin a frail little fag. Is Edmund Morris racist? I don't know.
Right. Well. See, that's a cheap. My personal estimation, that's a cheap trick. Say what's on your mind, and don't put it in a fictional character's mouth, even yourself. If you believe it, say it. If you don't, don't. But what do I know? So we've got. But let's go back to this about Reagan being. I remember this from the book, but let's just talk about that for a second. About Reagan being a divisive figure, even in his college years. Well, describe that if you don't mind.
Right. So I had these interviews done by the guy, the writer, by the way. His name's Paul Keyes, Keyes. Really good writer that writers who are listening to the show should check out. He wrote a great book called The Courage to Write. That's the book about writer's block. Actually, it's really fantastic. And so when he was a kind of a young journalist, he wanted to do an article for Esquire about Ronald Reagan, a profile of him in college, and he did tons of research, handed over all his files, which was amazing, very generous. And these interviews, these typed-up interviews, typed up on his, his 1966 typewriter, with a dozen people, including, people who were teachers at Eureka College and classmates of his. And it's fascinating. They almost kind of divide down the middle. Half are like, oh, I knew he would add up to great things, and he was such a leader, and he was so charismatic, and he was so charming, and he was so wonderful, and, I'd follow him anywhere. And half were like, this guy's just a giant phony. And, one of them says, I read his memoir in which he describes the student strike we had at Eureka, and it doesn't even feel like we went to the same school. So, some people think he's a hero, and some people think he's a phony. Isn't that pretty much how it is now?
Yeah, I think it is. And by the way, a lot of people don't remember, but in the 1976 primary election, Gerald Ford said, Ronald Reagan doesn't dye his hair, he's just prematurely orange.
Yeah, that was at the Gridiron dinner. He had hired a joke writer because people didn't think he was funny enough.
It was a good line.
Good line, yeah.
But now, going forward, I guess, so we've got, and by the way, I met Nancy Reagan, I've met Reagan's daughter, bright people, compelling people. I mean, this is a guy, and I think it comes across in your book. It's not that this guy has no substance. I mean, he has considerable substance. He has considerable intelligence. He has enormous gifts. I think you portray all of that in this book. And I guess I just want to bring us around to the title, The Invisible Bridge. I think it comes from a quote, I think if I recall correctly, from Churchill, about an
interesting misrecollection of yours, RJ. It comes from Nikita Khrushchev.
Well, fat bald guys who ran countries. Yeah. That's how it got filed.
He gave, of all things, he gave Richard Nixon political advice. He said, if the people think that there's an imaginary river out there, don't tell them it's not there. Build an imaginary bridge.
Which is a brilliant quote. Whichever fat guy running a country said it, number one. Number two, a perfect metaphor, in my opinion, for the Reagan rise, because there was a mythology based on fear that we were losing the America we had. And we, in this case, I would argue, meaning white people, were losing the mythical America that certainly wasn't the America of Reagan's childhood.
There you go again.
There you go again. And so, was that your thinking as we wrap up in choosing that title, The Invisible Bridge? Or
it was basically like this was a guy who was really great at creating mythology and taught us to kind of dwell in mythology. And, my concluding thought would be, he's the guy who's responsible for this kind of, every politician have to make this ritual announcement that America is the greatest country in the world and can do no wrong and can make no mistakes. And these Republicans running around saying Democrats don't believe in American exceptionalism. And, Samantha Power, in her, confirmation hearings to be UN ambassador, when she was asked, what sins she identifies in the American past by Marco Rubio, says America is the greatest country in the world and we have nothing to apologize for. That kind of nonsense that keeps us from kind of looking our past straight in the face and looking at the problems of our present and fixing them, that comes out of Reagan, and that actually probably had as big an effect on the country as any, regressive tax cut or hike he ever made.
Well, and perhaps even bigger, but, as Nikita Khrushchev said, we will fight them on the seas, we will fight them. No, wrong, that was Churchill. Listen, Rick Perlstein.
I'm banging my platform shoes on the desk here.
Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, author of The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, a terrific book that I strongly recommend everyone read. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Richard. Goodbye.
Bye. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, speaking to you from a world at war. War in Iraq. War in Gaza, war in Syria, undeclared simmering wars all around the globe. And this is not the future, the 21st century, as it was envisioned at the close of the Cold War. At the close of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the European Communist hailed in this country as a transformative moment, as a moment when the world need no longer be gripped in conflict. There was a belief in a kind of good versus evil simplistic structure that said everything that happened around the globe was a reflection of the fight against communism. And with European communism out of the way, and with the United States able to assume a role of sole global superpower, our country could become a keeper of peace, a spreader of democracy and wealth and prosperity. Apparently, It hasn't turned out that way. In the three major conflicts that are going on right now in the Middle East, the deteriorating situation in Iraq, the terrible slaughter and violence in Gaza, and the ongoing difficulties in Syria. And at least two of those three instances, the United States is involved supporting is either a perpetrator of violence, or has been, or has triggered the violence, or is supporting the violence in some way. Here's what I mean. In Gaza, the United States very heavily arms and supports the Israeli military, and has done very little to restrain that military, probably for domestic reasons. But I would not leave aside the economic interests involved in arming the Israeli military. A lot of people are making a lot of money that way, and those people have an enormous amount of political influence. So we are, in effect, supporting one combatant in and by far the dominant military force in that part of the world where horrific suffering is now taking place in Gaza. That's number one. Number two, Iraq. We were brought into Iraq partially for ideological reasons, the Project for a New American Century. The neoconservative group had been targeting Iraq for a long time. President Bush gave in to their wishes, even though Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks or Al-Qaeda. So we had that invasion take place. But there again, there was an enormous relationship between the economic interests of defense contractors and their friends and associates in government and the invasion of Iraq. Now, this many years later, we are still involved in Iraq, as we are still involved in Afghanistan, where this week a 2-star American general was murdered in what appears to be a friendly fire incident from the Afghan forces we're arming. That's another common trend that seems to be taking place. We arm the Israelis. We arm the Iraqi military. We arm ISIS, the terrifying group which is now holding large swaths of land and persecuting religious and ethnic minorities. They got those weapons through, they would not have those weapons if we had not invaded that country. So in this hour, we'll be talking to Stephen Miles of World Without War about what exactly is going on in these conflict areas and what concerned American citizens can do about changing the government's role in these places. Because as we now know, the United States is once again apparently escalating its involvement, at least when it comes to airstrikes within Iraq. So we got ourselves into this. We created the chaotic situation in Iraq. What do we do to get out of it? What do we do to avoid future horrific bloodshed in Gaza, where, as we learned only recently, the ceasefire has been violated again? What do we do about Syria? These are the questions that press us. And on a more broad scale, on the big picture side of things, what do we do to make sure that the economic interests of the defense industry, that military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about 50 years ago, what do we do to make sure that that influence is blunted and we no longer run our government to serve the interests of the defense industry, but rather to serve the interests of people here in this country and around the globe? We'll have that conversation in this hour. There'll be more to come after this break. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is Stephen Miles, who is the Advocacy Director for Win Without War. He is the coalition coordinator as well. It's a diverse coalition, 40-member organizations who came together in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and to the underlying national security strategy which created them. He's a veteran of campaign politics, grassroots advocacy. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics and of Tulane University, with academic expertise in humanitarian interventions in Middle East politics. He's written recently about both the American public's view on military intervention in Syria and on the situation in Iraq. And of course, two of the three hotspots in the world today are Syria and Iraq. In addition, we now have the continued humanitarian crisis and tragedy in Gaza. So we have a lot to talk about with that. Stephen Miles, Win Without War, thanks so much for joining us on The Zero Hour.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I wish, we never seem to come together and have a conversation during happy circumstances, but that's the way it is right now, and that's the assignment we've both taken on in our respective ways. So I wanted to really talk to you about that underlying national security strategy that you talked about. But at first, we can talk a little bit about what's going on right now. These three countries are in the news: Iraq, Syria, and Gaza. But we also have Iran, and we also have the underlying patterns that these conflicts represent. But if you wouldn't mind, for our audience, just giving us a quick update at the close of this week as to what's going on in Iraq.
Sure, it's been an eventful week in Iraq. There's been a number of developments, primarily in northern Iraq, that I think are what most folks have seen in the news. So, starting a few days ago, the militants, formerly known as Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL, as they're sometimes called, started a campaign, offensive against Kurdish positions, the Kurdish forces known as the Peshmerga. There was a series of kind of pitched battles in a number of towns in northern Iraq, with ISIS, for the most part, gaining the upper hand. Started to pick up the attention of the administration and others, and really kind of two things happened that are causing the situation we have now. The first is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50,000 members of an ethnic minority group, the Yazidis, were trapped on a mountain in kind of northern Iraq, and stranded without any food or water up there. The second situation was that the forces got close to Erbil. The ISIS forces got close to Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdish region, home to a U.S. consulate, which has a couple hundred of personnel, and some of the American military advisors. So in response to those developments, what we saw was the administration, the president announced two things last night. One was that the U.S. had conducted an airlift of food and water into the stranded Yazidis on the mountain and authorized military action if necessary to help protect them. The other was that the president authorized military action to help protect Erbil. Earlier today, we saw the first airstrikes as part of that. They were in relation to the situation in Erbil. There was some ISIS artillery pieces that were within range of Erbil, and two fighter jets from a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf bombed those locations. And once again, for the first time in this presidency, and unfortunately the fourth presidency in a row, we saw American bombs falling in Iraq.
So, and that's a very important point, that this is now the fourth president in a row to bomb this country. We'll get back to that, but now you mentioned that ISIS, or ISIL as it's sometimes known, that ISIS has munitions, heavy munitions, and it would be useful for people to understand, how did they get them?
Absolutely. So the shortest answer is that they got them from us.
Right.
We had, for years, spent several $1 billion supplying the Iraqi military forces with some heavy armaments, some very serious weapons, things like M1 Abrams tanks, armored Humvees, night vision goggles, rifles, all sorts of other types of weapons. As ISIS has traveled through Iraq and marched through Iraq and captured Iraqi military bases, they've captured those things. And so we're now in the position of potential U.S. airstrikes against U.S.-made tanks, for example. I mean, it's kind of a Kafka-esque situation, if you will, but it's part of the reality of the situation that we have been kind of flooding the region with munitions in the hopes of, quote-unquote, supplying the good guys. But as often happens in a situation like this, the quote-unquote bad guys got their hands on those very same weapons, and we find ourselves now facing a well-supplied enemy who is looking to use their own weapons against American interests.
And we'll get to the good guys and bad guys piece of it in a moment, because I also think that's important for our audience to understand. But we also face the possibility, for example, I assume, of an American military airplane being shot down by an American-made anti-aircraft gun, for example. So we're actually putting American lives at risk of being taken with American munitions. And along those lines, I did want to mention, even though we're talking about Iraq and not Afghanistan, that this week was the week that we also saw the killing of an American general, a two-star general. I believe that was this week, right?
Yeah, it was earlier this week. He was the highest-ranked military official, member of the U.S. military, killed in Afghanistan. Killed in one of these quote-unquote insider attacks, where what we saw was someone wearing a uniform of an Afghan military. A bit unclear still if he was part of the Afghan military or someone else, but got into the installation and opened fire on the room where the general was. It's worth noting this took place at essentially the Afghan West Point. This was a general who was one of the leaders of training the Afghan forces. It was a tragic situation. It's a not uncommon situation, unfortunately, and it's one of the realities of what's now, a war almost in its 13th year, or almost in its 14th year. I'm sorry.
And as this war goes into its 14th year, the parallel I was drawing, however imperfect, is that in this case, I mean, obviously ISIS obtained these weapons militarily, but what we're finding in Afghanistan in these insider cases is that frequently they are people we have both armed and trained, who, whether it's police or military, who then turn on us and use our own weapons against us, which suggests, I guess that's one of the through lines here, other than the kind of tragic irony of it all. One of the through lines is that it seems to me that we're entering into parts of the world that we don't understand very well. We're flooding those regions with arms, and we're in some cases training people with very little historical understanding of how they came to be where they are today. And in the end, not to be overly simplistic about it, but the gun sellers win and everybody else seems to be in the line of fire. Is that a fair way to interpret what's going on?
I think it's absolutely fair. I mean, I think it is a worthwhile analogy to draw. When you pour gasoline on a fire, it has a tendency to explode, right? That's the reality of the situation we're living in. It was exacerbated, or it was highlighted just a couple weeks ago, actually. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, someone known as SIGAR in Washington, D.C. acronym speak, released a report that said there are hundreds of thousands of U.S.-supplied assault rifles in Afghanistan that the Afghans have no idea where they are. Now, they may have some, they may have most of them, but the fact is they have no system of tracking them, maintaining them. They don't know where they are. They don't know who they are. So the reality is very clearly, not only with the insider attacks, but quite frankly, also some of the members of the Taliban and others have probably been getting their hands on these weapons. And so we're finding our soldiers who are still out on patrol in Afghanistan, who are still out in harm's way, being shot at with American weapons that we gave into the conflict.
And we also have the case, since I know a little bit more about money than I do about guns, where enormous amounts of cash have been infused into both Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't know where a lot of that money is too. So we have cash, we have guns. How did we get in the situation where we're just flooding a nation with guns and then losing track of them?
I think part of the problem is that we come to these situations quite frequently where we have a very understandable impulse to want to do something and to want to do something to help the situation. But the problem is we have very few tools in our toolkit to be able to do that. And after decades of only funding the military, after decades of shoveling hundreds of billions of dollars at the Pentagon, at the same time, we're defunding our diplomatic efforts. We're defunding the State Department, defunding development agencies. We're not doing things like helping democracy development. We're not doing things that actually help people avoid some of these conflicts. Every time one of these problems happens, the only thing that we have in our toolkit is the military. And so we reach for the military. We say, here's a problem. Let's throw some bombs at it and see if that solves it. And of course, it never does. But when all you have at your disposal is the world's most highly trained, well-equipped military, it becomes very, very tempting to just reach for that as a quote-unquote simple solution to what are inevitably complex problems that we don't understand. And until we have a real serious reorientation of our foreign policy and understanding that we have to demilitarize our foreign policy, we're going to keep finding ourselves back in this same situation every time another crisis develops around the world.
Well, and I want to get I want to get back to that whole idea of a demilitarized foreign policy. I'm just making a note to myself now so that I don't forget. But the other element that I think people don't realize about, or many people don't realize about Iraq, because even the presidential candidate John McCain was fuzzy on it, is that it's probably the Yazidis are also members of a small religious minority as well as an ethnic minority, but primarily there has historically been a conflict between Sunni and Shiite Muslims in that country, and ISIS represents the Sunni segment, whereas the Shiite majority now controls the government. And one of the things that got us into this mess, now this is me talking, and you understand this area better than I do, so correct me whenever I'm wrong. But one of the things I want to get to, especially when we come back to break, but maybe you can give us a brief thing, is to what extent did we misread the Sunni Shiite split and maybe have too much faith in Maliki as a leader?
We have misread this situation from the get-go. I mean, we're talking today about relying on the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military forces. There was a serious effort in the early part of the war during the Bush administration to demilitarize the Peshmerga, to disband them, to get rid of them. That just kind of tells you the craziness of where we are today. A lot of the decisions that were made early on by folks like Paul Bremer, by folks like Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, names that kind of should haunt us when we hear them again. A lot of the decisions that were made with no understanding of the ethnic divide, no understanding of the religious divide in the situation. We're living today with the consequences of those decisions. And as tempting as it is to try to think that we can solve them, they're problems that were created decades ago. They're problems that were exacerbated by decisions made years ago. And there's really no quick and easy solution today that we have to fix them.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get back from break. We're talking with Stephen Miles of the World Without War Coalition about the situation in Iraq. We'll also get to a couple other conflict zones as well. So please stick with us. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with us again is Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War, which I mistakenly called World Without War in the last segment, without even knowing I was making that mistake, because I know the name is Win Without War. And so let's just take this opportunity briefly before we go back to the situation in Iraq. Stephen, would you mind just telling our audience for a minute what the Win Without War Coalition is, who it is?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, happy to. We would like a world without war too. So if there's a mistake to be made, that's not a bad one. Okay. The Win Without War Coalition is coming together of about 36 national organizations that originally came together in 2002 in the original run-up to the Iraq War. It was groups who didn't necessarily work on these kinds of issues, but felt the need to come together because of how disastrous the Iraq War would be for American policy, both foreign and domestic. I mean, the impacts we've seen in terms of the trillions of dollars spent and the thousands of lives, American lives lost, really have long-lasting domestic impacts. And so the groups have continued to stay together as a coalition, working for years to finally end that war, working on other issues like preventing a war with Iran, helping to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. And now, unfortunately, we're right back where it all began, trying to make sure that the U.S. doesn't get embroiled in another war in Iraq.
And exact. So sadly, we've come full circle, and you guys put out a statement on the situation in Iraq, which begins as follows. The Win Without War Coalition remains deeply opposed to a U.S. military intervention that places our men and women in uniform in harm's way in Iraq, which must have given you a sense of deja vu to write. It goes on to say, we must not become a Kurdish air force in a sectarian civil war. As history has shown, it concludes it is impossible to bomb your way to peace. So here we have a situation where, from the beginning, we intervened, we destabilized the situation where a Sunni minority had been exerting control through Saddam Hussein, and now we unleashed the dogs of sectarian civil war. And by the way, I should add that around the world, Sunni and Shiite Muslim clerics have gotten together, including in this country, to proclaim their one community, and they reject the divisiveness. But in a situation like Iraq, where these sectarian divisions also break down along village and sometimes tribal lines and so on, they're very deeply embedded. We didn't understand that. We destabilized the situation. We've got this tragedy going on now. If, as we both agree, you and I, it is impossible to bomb your way to peace, what is the way forward in Iraq, and what is our role in it as a nation?
Well, so there's a couple different things there. There's first and foremost a humanitarian crisis with the Yazidis, as we talked about earlier. And I think it's important to point out that there is a role the U.S. can play there. And it's one of the nice opportunities where we can use all of that money that we've spent putting together military resources, and we can use it to do something like drop food and water for people who are, frankly, dying of thirst and starvation. And we can provide an immediate relief for those folks. And we did that yesterday. There's likely to be some more missions there. And that is one of those types of situations where there is a unique role the U.S. military can play. By most reports, when the Iraqi Air Force tried to do this, they botched it, and most of the water that they dropped to those folks was spilled. And there's some real unique capacities we have, and if we have an opportunity, we shouldn't hesitate to use those. What we shouldn't do is get caught up in a civil war that, frankly, has been going on for decades. We are now potentially becoming a Kurdish Air Force. We're inserting ourselves directly in the middle of it, and we're risking making Sunnis, most Sunnis, the vast majority of them, want nothing to do with the horrible militants of ISIS, of the Islamic State. They're brutal. They have just desecrated everything that they've touched. Their violence is kind of unspeakable. But what you see is a conflict in which Sunnis are being asked to choose between them and a corrupt government that was providing them no security, that was threatening their lives, and which frankly treats them as the enemy. And so in that situation, given that choice, folks have made the calculus that it's better to side with the Sunnis of ISIS than it is to side with the government in Baghdad or the Kurds in Erbil. Changing that calculus is the fundamental thing that needs to happen to change the dynamics on the ground. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 ISIS soldiers, militants. They are incredibly well armed. They are incredibly well financed. But the reality is they're only able to do what they're doing because of the underlying political willingness of so many people to go along with them. You can't begin to solve this problem until you change that calculus. And as the president himself said, there is not a military solution to this conflict. And when we find ourselves in a position where there is no military solution, what we saw in Iraq the last time, what we're seeing in Afghanistan still today, is that when you throw bombs at the problem, it ends up very, very badly.
So if we agree that we shouldn't be throwing bombs, then the answer is A, humanitarian aid, and B, looking for other solutions. Now, 10,000 combatants in ISIS is a large number, but I'm trying to remember the total population of Iraq. Is it 18 million, 20 million, something like that? Do you know offhand?
It's about 20 million. There's several 100,000 between Iraqi security forces and various militias. So this is not kind of a question of numbers, right? This is a significant number of people. But don't forget, those 10,000 are also spread over a conflict that, frankly, is stretching from Lebanon all the way over to Iraq at this point. And so they, again, would not be able to do that were it not for the fact that Sunni tribes are taking up arms with them, that former members of Saddam's regime, who frankly never probably liked Saddam very much, but they were in his regime, and when we went in last time, we kicked them all out of their jobs. We said there was no place for them. A lot of them have taken up arms and are now fighting alongside of these Islamic militants, the ISIS militants. And so you see those numbers grow, but you also see that there's an ability to get rid of them. There's an ability to isolate them, make them be seen as alone. Part of that problem, though, is that the other players in the region, the Arab states in the Gulf, our friends in Turkey and elsewhere, until they feel that there's a viable partner in Baghdad to work with, they're not going to tolerate that. They're not going to make peace. They're not going to tell their friends in Iraq that they need to stop fighting side by side with ISIS. And so a huge part of this is dealing with the problem that the Maliki administration created. And it's frankly deeper than simply just getting rid of Maliki. There has to be a real movement toward inclusiveness and an Iraqi-led solution that the Iraqis of all stripes can learn to agree with. And they're going to have to tell us what that solution is. Trying to impose that solution on them is how we got in this mess in the first place.
And that's a great point. But what I'm trying to, you understand what I'm trying to get to, which is what is the approach we should support? And it sounds like what you're saying is basically it's telling the Iraqis they need to come up with an alternative that works, because we went in, we took out the government of Saddam Hussein, but we were careless about what we replaced it with. We took essentially an entire generation of civil servants and army members and dismissed them without consideration for their motives or what they would do once they were put out on the street. And then we basically looked the other way. And frankly, I would blame that on the Obama as well as the Bush administrations, although Bush was the one who got us into this mess, and I wouldn't hang that around President Obama's neck. But we allowed leaders like Maliki and his coalition partners to take over and provided very little attention or direction in terms of what we might like to see. And it's a tough one to nuance. It's a tough one to structure, what we should have said, what we should have done. But here we are. What should we be asking our elected officials? What should we be insisting that our elected officials do instead of showering the country with bombs?
Well, so you have to go back to that old adage, first do no harm. I mean, if this was kind of a one-off situation where we just got it wrong once with Iraq, you might be willing to say, let's give it another go, let's try. When we look at Afghanistan, not only do we get it wrong with the Mujahideen in the 80s, we got it wrong again with the Karzai government now. And you see this kind of time and time again as we get involved in these messes all around the world. We're very, very bad at picking winners and losers. We're very bad at understanding the situation thousands of miles away. And we really need to have a predisposition to not get in the middle of it. But there are some things we can do. You're absolutely right. So humanitarian response, both in terms of the immediate things like dropping food and water we talked about, but also helping deal with the refugee crisis. There's millions of displaced people in the region. They require shelter. They require food. The governments that are housing them require support to do so. And it may be that the case that there is some security needs or some needs for stabilization. If that's the case, what we should be looking to do is have a multilateral response, a truly international response. You know, there's opportunities to discuss this and take action through the UN. There's opportunities to engage not only our international partners in Europe, but also our partners in the region, like the Turks. There's conversations that are apparently being had with the Iranians, who, of course, are closer to Erbil than Erbil is to Baghdad. There's a lot, in terms of geography, there's a lot that can be done with folks in the area. Again, some of that requires us, frankly, being less involved and propping up one side versus another less than we are. And once American bombs start falling, what you see is that protecting the American pilots flying those missions, protecting any troops that end up there on the ground, that becomes our overarching interest. And understandably so. Protecting American lives is incredibly important. But you can't then do all those other things if you have a singular focus on protecting American lives. And so you have to be very, very careful about making the types of decisions that we're now talking about making.
Well, Stephen Miles of Win Without War, if you're willing to stick with us just a little longer, we'll take a break, and then I have a couple final questions for you, including the question, which may sound strange, do we really need to learn a kind of humility in these situations? But we'll get to that when we get back. We're talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War, about the situation in Iraq. We will be right back after these messages. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour talking with Stephen Miles, who is the Advocacy Director of Win Without War, and we're talking about the situation in Iraq. And Stephen, before we went to break, we were talking about an approach the U.S. government and the American people could take toward this conflict that involved bringing in regional players, European players, other allies. Sounds, part of my reaction, I had a several reactions. One was, do we really need to learn that we can't do it all, that we can't fix it all, that there are situations where, and that we shouldn't try to fix it all, that it's up to the Iraqi people and the people of the region to work this out, and that perhaps our best role could be to say we are withdrawing from a military place in this conflict and would be happy instead to facilitate A, humanitarian relief, and B, perhaps a series of conferences where we figure out how to allow the people in the region to make their own decisions.
Yeah, I mean, look, RJ, I think you're absolutely right. It's time, unfortunately, after kind of the dark lessons we've had to learn over the last 13 years, that we do have a little humility about what we can do and what we can't do. Now, it's one thing to note, though, that the American public have learned that lesson. When you look at kind of polls of the American public, or frankly, when you talk to anyone, you talk to people around the dinner table or in their living rooms, they get it. They understand there are limits to what we can do. It's frankly a lot of talking heads here in Washington who just don't get that message. You know, we've seen a real kind of clear response from Republicans here in D.C. that they not only support kind of the airstrikes in Iraq, but many of them saying we need to consider things like ground troops. Many of them saying this whole problem is that Obama somehow created this problem by ending the Iraq war and bringing our troops home. And many of them saying we're doing too little and we need to do much more. I mean, I think the American people look at that and they just think, what are you talking about? That is just not comport with the reality of the world that we live in and the reality of the situation that we've seen. This gets called kind of war weariness or isolationism a lot. I think those are not accurate descriptions. What's much more accurate is that the American public has learned the lesson you're talking about. People get it. They get there are limits to what we can do. And if two people want to kill each other and the only thing you can do is stand in between them and hope that they don't shoot you, or try to find a way to convince them not to kill each other. That's the reality of the situation we're in.
Well, so you've worked in politics, Stephen, and you know how the political process works. Do we need to, don't get run over, please.
Sorry about that.
Do we need to, we need you. So do we need to work on our friends in the Democratic Party to be a little bolder about challenging that rhetoric and saying, no, this is not how the world works, and, you know, we're not playing John Wayne in a cowboy movie with other people's lives anymore? Do we need to shift the rhetoric?
Yeah, absolutely. Democrats, you know, and progressives and kind of folks of all political stripes need to have a little more backbone and be willing to say, we've been right about most of this for the last several years. You know, we were right when we said the Iraq War was a disaster. And these guys who are listening to the Bill Kristols of the world, who said something completely different, who said we were going to be treated as liberators, that we should go in, you know, if they want to live in Dick Cheney's America, they can go off and they can try to create that somewhere else. But we were right, and that means we get to control what happens now. We get to decide where we go from here. You do need to have more ownership of that. There should be accountability. One of the problems we have is that there's no accountability. You know, you see Dick Cheney back out there on the Sunday TV shows talking about this stuff as if he didn't have the blood of thousands of Americans on his hands, as if there wasn't chaos throughout the Middle East from the very policies he pursued. The people who were right about this stuff the last time around, they're the ones we should be listening to now. And a lot of the voices like John McCain and a lot of those other guys in Washington, we need to stop listening to them because they keep getting it wrong.
And absolutely, I like your tone, man. Right now, I'm really digging your tone, number one. Number two, because I think we need to have the cojones to say that this is madness.
There was the last, you know, when all this started back in June, Meet the Press, you know, the venerable DC institution, has Paul Bremer on there, the guy who created most of this mess in Iraq with his horrible decisions. And no one says anything, hey, you were completely wrong. I mean, it took Dick Cheney going on Fox News and a Fox News anchor to say, but you've been wrong about all this. Democrats need to have some spine to stand up and say, hold on a second. If you've been wrong about the Middle East for the several last decades, you don't get to talk about it anymore. And if we've been right about it, we should have a chance to say, this is what we've been saying, and it's time we tried it out.
Yeah, and you know, I always say asking those guys about about Iraq is like asking the captain of the Exxon Valdez for navigation tips. It's just they're the guys who sank the whole thing. So the question now is, first of all, what do people do when they hear this conversation or conversations like it and they want to do something about it? They want to communicate with their elected representatives. They want to join their voices with voices like yours. What do they do? Where do they go?
So absolutely. So our website is www.winwithoutwar.org. On there's a number of resources. Our statement you mentioned earlier, folks can use our website to contact the members of Congress. But one of the nice things about my job is that I work for a coalition, and I'm sure that most of the people listening to this show are actually already members of some of the coalition members that we have. Great groups like Move On, like Credo. Folks are going to be getting emails from them in the next couple of days. Folks are going to be being asked to take action, whether it's by them or another organization. Open those emails, take action. Your voice matters. It's almost exactly a year ago that we had a similar situation come up in Syria. And I got to tell you, the fighter jets were on the tarmac. They were fueled up. The bombs were loaded. We were really ready to go on that one. And the only thing that changed is that Americans stood up by the millions, and they said, no way, not again, we're not going to do it. And if Americans feel that way, they need to have their voices heard. This was a very complicated situation. No one's expecting that the folks listening to this call or average Americans have all the answers. But what they can do is that they know there are things that they don't want to see. They don't want to see America back in another war in Iraq. Then they should tell their members of Congress that, and they should say, this is why we elected you. Go find another solution. They don't have to have all the answers, but they should feel free to say what they feel.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but extremely well said. And thanks so much for joining us, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War at winwithoutwar.org. We'll keep abreast of this situation. I hope you'll come back and join us again on the Zero Hour.
Happy to be on anytime. Have a good day, RJ.
Thanks, you too. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be back after this on the Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. And for a moment, let's play Follow the Money. Preliminary reports issued this week say that a $16 to $17 billion settlement will soon be announced between the Justice Department and Bank of America to cover fraud around their handling of mortgages. This would break the record for the largest bank settlement in history, a record which was set less than a year ago by a $13 billion agreement between the Justice Department and J.P. Morgan Chase. The numbers that accompany these deals announcements always seem impressive, but how large are they really? Well, I guess that depends on your point of view. Look at it this way. Bankers fraudulently inflated a housing bubble for the entire nation. They became extremely wealthy as a result, but the U.S. market for housing lost $6.3 trillion in value when that bubble burst. It's only recovered about 44% of the lost value as of the end of 2013, which is when we have the best data. That's more than $3 trillion, give or take, that's still missing from American wealth. As of the first quarter of this year, 9.1 million homes, 17% of mortgage residences, were still, quote unquote, seriously underwater, which means that homeowners owed at least 25% more on the home than it was worth. And who do they owe that money to? The bankers. And homeowners weren't the only ones hurt by banker misdeeds and crimes. When that bubble burst, it took the whole economy with it. Unemployment and underemployment remain at record levels more than 5 years later, even as the stock market surges and corporations enjoy record profits. Compared to the wealth that bank fraud has taken from American households, these settlements are nothing more than a drop in the ocean. So are bankers now making right what they did wrong with these settlements? Well, if you're like most Americans, you probably know somebody who's been through a foreclosure or has been victimized by dishonest mortgage practices. You're far less likely to know someone who has experienced meaningful relief from a foreclosure fraud settlement or these types of deals. Why do you think that is? Well, let's look at it this way. Payments on those 9.1 million underwater mortgages are a form of wealth transfer from Main Street to Wall Street as homeowners continue to overpay the very same bankers who inflated those mortgages in the first place. They risk losing their homes to them if they don't pay. And if this added burden harms their credit score, they'll pay banks even more for other forms of borrowing. And yet, these big number settlements don't require banks to provide principal relief for these underwater homeowners. They don't ask banks to return homes that they wrongfully took from their owners. They don't ask banks to forfeit every penny of earnings they received through forgery, perjury, or other crimes. They don't even ask banks to restore the credit ratings of customers that they've defrauded. On a broader scale, they don't ask banks to invest in job creation, increase their lending to job-creating enterprises, or even to refrain from other forms of consumer fraud. Instead, these deals are limited to addressing a very limited set of harmful activities and don't even fully compensate victims for the harms those activities caused. In other words, there's less to these sorts of deals than meets the eye. Even more true when you think about the way the deals are structured. A big part of those deals, in the case of the $16 to $17 billion deal, as much as $7 or $8 billion, is supposed to come in the form of quote-unquote consumer relief. But banks have been gaming those numbers for years now, ever since the government did a $25 billion deal with them a while back. They called it a $25 billion deal, but a big chunk of that money was supposed to go to consumer relief. What did banks do? They've been abusing that whole situation. They've been giving new loan amounts to people when it serves their own interest. And then when they do that, they take that money and they count it against the $25 billion settlement or the $13 billion settlement or the $17 billion settlement or the $9 billion settlement that Citigroup recently went into. In other words, these settlements aren't really for $25 billion or $16 billion or $17 billion or $9 billion. They're for a lot less than that. On top of that, some of these deals are tax deductible. This one may be too. If so, Americans will get shortchanged on the federal level too because they won't have to pay. Worst of all, nothing in these settlements will dissuade bankers from engaging in similar crimes and misadventures in the future. When the New York Times studied bank settlements a few years ago, it found that banks routinely violated the pledges they made in agreements like these. And why wouldn't they? There's no penalty for doing it. Bank of America, as of the end of 2011, had already violated agreements like this 6 times and gone on to do exactly the same kind of fraud they promised not to do. Since then, they've been part of that $25 billion fraud deal, a $9.3 billion multi-bank settlement that took place in 2013, and an $8.5 billion agreement with a group of mortgage investors it had defrauded. These are not banks that reform themselves. And if bankers don't go to jail for the crimes they've committed, they never will reform themselves. Why? Because, remember, banks don't commit crimes, bankers do. And until bankers, rather than banks, are punished, there's a good chance the crimes will continue. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. We're going to talk for a few minutes about inversions. We'll explain what they are in a minute, but first we'll give the President of the United States, who appears to be stepping up a bit on this issue, to give his own take on what corporate tax inversions are. We have some audio of the President discussing this issue, and we'll play it for you right now.
You have accountants going to some big corporations, multinational corporations, but that are clearly U.S. based and have the bulk of their operations in the United States. And these accountants are saying, you know what, we found a great loophole. If you just flip your citizenship to another country, even though it's just a paper transaction, we think we can get you out of paying a whole bunch of taxes.
Okay, let's leave it there. I mean, he goes on at length. I don't feel he was bringing his best game to this topic, but he is. I think he's identifying a good point, an important issue, and he's on the right side of it. Let's break it down for you. Okay, you got this massive corporate tax loophole called an inversion, which allows American corporations to acquire little foreign corporations and then change nationalities. It's altering the political debate in some strange ways to talk about this. The president is now talking about economic patriotism, and some of his supporters are talking about even asking corporations to sign loyalty oaths. Suddenly, the right has gone anti-patriotic in its rhetoric. They sound like barefoot hippies hitchhiking through India in the 60s. They sound like stateless love children for whom national identity and loyalty are as disposable as candy wrappers. You can almost hear him say, "Hey, I'm a citizen of Earth, man." That's the right wing. Meanwhile, the president and his team are talking about economic patriotism and loyalty oaths. And one of his supporters in the media even suggested putting flag decals on corporate logos. So it looks like the tax code isn't the only thing being inverted around here. So's the political debate. And as for the White House, I understand why they're talking about phrases like economic patriotism, and the president's characterization of what that means is certainly inoffensive. He said this about what it means. He said, it means, quote, "Don't double down on top-down economics. Let's really fight to make sure everybody gets a chance. And by the way, everybody plays by the same rules." Well, that's pretty innocuous. In fact, it's designed so that nobody can object. He doesn't propose reversing top-down economics for a while, for example, which is something that I support. And as for the rest of it, everybody gets a chance. Everybody plays by the same rules. Even the right shouldn't be outraged by these ideas. So it's really all more, again, made-up right-wing controversy. We can only imagine what would have happened if the president had boldly come out in favor of mom and apple pie. They'd probably have gone ballistic. So they really got riled up about this patriotism framing to the whole idea of the inversion tax break. But you know what? So what? They were very upset that some people in the president's administration have begun using the phrase corporate deserters to describe companies that invert themselves out of this country. Okay, I prefer the term corporate defector, but deserters close enough. So, in fact, it's even beginning to have a good impact on what's going on here. The Walgreens Corporation, which had been talking about inverting itself to Switzerland, has decided not to do that. And that was after pressure from activists, pressure from consumers, and pressure from a few politicians like Senator Dick Durbin. So this week it announced that the drugstore chain, which advertises itself as being located at, quote, "the corner of healthy and happy," end quote, would not be relocating to a corner somewhere in Bern, Switzerland, where its small Swiss subsidiary exists. But what are these inversions really? It sounds complicated. It sounds boring. The president sounds bored when he talks about it. Is it really all that complicated? No, it's not. We don't need new ideas. We don't need new rhetoric. We don't need new ways to think about it. It's just more tax breaks for coddled corporations. So progressive, please. Democrats, please put down the jingoism and step away slowly. Here are 6 simple ways to understand corporate inversions. Number 1, it's just a trick. It's an international duck and cover scheme. It doesn't reflect any fundamental principles of economics or law. It's just a way to get out of paying taxes. 20 years ago, corporate tax inversions were rare, and you know what? American companies did just fine without them. Number 2, inversions is a standalone issue. Republicans keep trying to say we need corporate tax reform, which in today's political parlance is a euphemism for tax cuts, in order to end inversions. No, we don't. The actual tax rates for U.S. corporations, which is the amount they actually pay, is on the very low end by international standards and very, very low when compared to the way it's been in previous years. So as the president and others have pointed out, we'll never be able to get our tax rates low enough to end inversions. We don't want a race to the bottom. Somebody will always underbid us. So no, we don't need to change the corporate tax code. We just need to end inversions. Another point. The government can renegotiate its contracts. We can do that by executive order. Loyalty oaths may be creepy, but contract negotiations aren't. It's perfectly reasonable for the government to set rules which say that only U.S. companies can bid on federal contracts and to negotiate contracts which provide requirements companies must meet to keep making all this money off the U.S. taxpayer. If that includes a U.S. companies only rule or a no inversions clause, that's perfectly reasonable. So let's go ahead and do that. Another point, money matters. Corporate executives do, in fact, have a responsibility to maximize profits for their shareholders. So we can't expect them to do the right thing just because the president lectures them about it. That's why they're inverting in the first place. But when they begin losing profits because they can't negotiate federal contracts or because American customers refuse to buy their products, it will then become their responsibility to uninvert their corporations, at least in some cases. So we should do that. And don't let them distract us. This is a loophole that has to be closed. A lot of companies have already slithered through the loophole, but we can close it. We should do it immediately without further delay. And lastly, sure, we need comprehensive tax solutions, and eventually we'll get them. But that means working around the lawyers, the lobbyists, and the other people who are rigging the game. So we'll get there. But in the meantime, close the loopholes, end the aversions, and let the president use his executive authority to make things right. It's simple. It's what needs to be done, and it needs to be done immediately. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. You know, a couple senators had something to say this week, and I wanted to share both of their comments with you. We've got audio. The first is Senator John McCain, who, along with Senator Lindsey Graham, was upset about something. Let's hear about it.
Then there's another issue here, and that is that a legally constituted carrying out of the Senate's responsibilities of the Senate Intelligence Committee, they were carrying out an investigation. Their work was spied upon and maybe perhaps even impeded by another agency and another branch of government who vociferously denied that that was taking place.
The CIA tried to protect itself. The CIA apparently tried to gain information from a congressional investigation to mold the outcome to protect itself.
This is, to me, the utmost seriousness. What did the director of the CIA know, and when did he know it? And what action did he take if he knew about it? And if he didn't know about it, why in the world didn't he know? This is out of a movie. And I really never believed that an agency of government, particularly with the capabilities of the CIA, would carry out such actions, which is a clearly unconstitutional.
Come on, Senator. Okay, we're going to cut in right here. Okay, so that was Senators John McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham. Of course, we agree with them. It's outrageous that the CIA was spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee, possibly even tampering with their files, but certainly reading them. This is outrageous. This is tampering with the workings of government. It's clearly unconstitutional, but it's just so striking how selective their outrage is, and I would include in that, in the spirit of bipartisanship, Senator Dianne Feinstein. All of these senators are more than happy to cover up and make excuses for the national intelligence complex when it violates the constitutional rights of ordinary Americans again and again and again and again. They have no problem with it. They'll stick with the intelligence services against the American people every time. But when it comes to spying on them, suddenly it's an outrage. Suddenly I've never heard of such a thing. Suddenly they want to ask of the CIA director, when they've been lied to by intelligence directors in documented ways over and over, suddenly they want to know when did he know and what did he know and when did he know it, a reference to Watergate and the crimes of Watergate. But it's so interesting to me that these senators have so much more regard for their personal rights than they do for the rights of the American people as a whole. So Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and we will throw Senator Feinstein in with that, We feel your pain because we're being spied on every day, but we also note your hypocrisy. In other Senate news, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid had some words as they went off for their August recess about what's going to happen in September. Let's hear from Senator Reid on that.
Mr. President, before we finish our business and senators return for the work period at home, I want everyone to know about what's going to happen when we come back. Following the August recess, we're going to convene on September 8th, and we're going to be here for 1 week, 2 weeks, and 2 days. That's it. September 23rd is our target date to adjourn until after the election. I hope we can do that. We need to pass appropriations measures to keep the government from shutting down. We need to pass temporary extension of the Internet Tax Freedom Act. We need to do something about, of course, as I just mentioned, about XM Bank. We have to do the Defense Authorization Bill, which is extremely important for the fighting men and women of this country. We are going to address the Udall Constitutional Amendment on campaign finance reform, and we're going to reconsider a number of issues. College affordability, minimum wage, Hobby Lobby, student debt. So we have a lot of work to do. So everyone needs to know, Mr. President, when we come back here on September 8th, there will be no weekends off. There's only 2 weekends till we go home. And everyone should not plan things on this weekend. No one can say, well, you need to give us some notice. We've given you notice. Every day between September 8th and September 30th is fair game. Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, we need to be here.
All right. Now, I'm going to say this for Senator Harry Reid. I don't necessarily agree with him on every issue, but to this statement, which he made to his fellow senators, be prepared to work, be prepared to vote on some of the issues you guys do not want to even discuss on the other side of the aisle. We say, boom. That's the way Democrats should be. That's the way they should have been all along. They should have been out there, and I'm glad he's doing it now, saying, no, you're not going home before this election, because remember, when they break at the end of September, that's it from then until the election in November. So he's saying to them, you're not going home. Finish your campaigns for office until you vote. Do you support the minimum wage or do you not? Do you support the amendment which would take money out of, at least a lot of the money out of American politics, or do you not? Do you support rights for women or do you not? Do you support overturning the Hobby Lobby decision or do you not? Until you vote on those things, senators of both parties, you're not getting out of here. That's what we need to see. Instead of people who are only concerned about their own rights and their own privileges and protecting their own status as members of the Senate, we need more people. We need more Democrats in Washington saying, no, you're not going home until you take a stand on this issue one way or the other. Good on you, Harry Reid, and thanks for doing that. We'll be watching in September. We'll be right back after this break. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. It's time for a few randomly selected news items and items of note. First of all, Friday of this week is International Cat Day. It's not just Domestic Cat Day, it's International Cat Day. And in honor of that, I decided we have 2 cats. Before I met my wife, I was a dog owner for many years. I love dogs, love cats. Decided to settle the argument, which animal is more intelligent. According to recent studies, scientists at Oxford University have concluded that the dog is slightly more intelligent. At least it has a larger brain, which probably evolved because it is a more social creature. On the other hand, cats don't seem to appear to need anybody or anything, which suggests a different kind of very useful intelligence. So International Cat Day, don't take anything I say the wrong way. I love my cats. But that's what the science says. Okay. Now, on a very, very different mood tone altogether, the New York Times announced on Thursday that it will finally use the word torture to describe the United States' controversial interrogation tactics on terrorist suspects. Said the Times executive editor, quote, "From now on, the Times will use the word torture to describe incidents in which we know for sure that interrogators inflicted pain on a prisoner in an effort to get information." This is, they all love to use euphemisms. Reuters would call torture, quote unquote, brutal interrogation methods. AP would call them, quote unquote, enhanced interrogation techniques. This comes after President Obama decided to finally admit that the CIA, in his odd choice of words, quote unquote, tortured some folks. That is a really odd way to put it. And disturbing, frankly. But from torture, we go to prison. Another new study shows that apparently white people like to put black people in jail. At least that's one way to interpret a Stanford study, which showed that white people, quote, are more likely to support, according to this report from Alternet, are more likely to support harsher criminal justice policies if provided with evidence that shows our criminal justice system disproportionately targets black people. In other words, if you talk to white people about some of the unfair ways in which people are incarcerated, for example, for drug usage, marijuana possession or whatever, stop and frisk, 3 strikes laws, and so on, they will object to it. But then when you point out to them that our prison system disproportionately incarcerates African Americans, suddenly you retest them, you find them more likely to endorse harsh law enforcement that puts people in prison. And other details pointed out, black Americans account for only 13% of the population, yet they make up more than 40% of state prisoners. And we have all seen those statistics which show that African Americans are far more likely to be incarcerated for marijuana usage, even though marijuana usage between African Americans and white people is very, very similar. So in the second experiment, 2 different groups of white New Yorkers were shown statistical data informing them about the racial disparities of the prison population that made them more likely to support stop and frisk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what can we conclude from this? I think what we can conclude from this is fairly obvious. I think we can conclude from this that white people are more comfortable with law enforcement when it's not affecting them, and or when it is putting people other than them and or people who frighten them in prison. Now, of course, this is directly or indirectly something that we can rightfully call racism. But on the other hand, white people do live in fear. A lot of them do. I mean, I'm not talking about every white person, but I'm certainly talking about the kind of people who, A, want to put black people in jail, B, believe that our president is a illegal Kenyan Muslim socialist not born in this country, C, want tougher gun laws, D, want abortion outlawed, and E, hate immigrants of all kinds. Now, why are these people driven in fear? Well, if you think about it in one way, I attended a lecture by a Buddhist teacher who had made some great points about that. He worked in his name is Ken McLeod, he worked in the fields of conflict avoidance and negotiation and all that. And Ken McLeod points out that these types of people who live in this kind of fear actually have a pretty good point going for them, in the sense that, yes, their way of life is dying out. Yes, people don't no longer believe in the kind of values that used to be the majority values, at least among white people in this country. Younger generations, even of evangelical Christians, don't hold the same views that the older generations do. Also, this is no longer going to be a white majority country, so that particular bastion of privilege is collapsing, and they're afraid. They live in a world of fear in which minorities are swarming over the border, changing their way of life. In other words, they can't adapt to change. When confronted with change, rather than embracing it, saying, hey, we're going to be a more diverse country, we're going to be a country that includes different kinds of people, isn't it going to be interesting to see what happens? they can't. Hostility for gay marriage, that's another manifestation of this. Instead of saying, well, that's interesting, I never thought about gay people marrying, but why not? Their attitude is, we can't do that because they're desperately trying to cling to a way of life that they feel is dying. And you know what? It is dying. And so we can have, even though we despise racism, I hope we can have a little bit of sympathy for people who are so bound up in fear that they can't unclench themselves long enough to embrace change and instead have to fight it. Now, that takes sometimes hideous and terrible forms, Clive and Bundy, gun violence, horrific things. But maybe if we can understand that the people who are not quite that crazy and dangerous, but the people who are just living in constant fear, if we can understand that it is an issue of constant fear, maybe we can find new ways to debate the issues, new ways to talk to them, because right now we're just talking past each other. You've got right-wingers like Ann Coulter and apparently Sean Hannity as well, talking about how the Ebola doctors, the doctors who heroically went to Africa and put themselves at risk in order to treat people dying of that disease. We've got that one doctor coming back now and being treated in Atlanta. You've got these right-wingers saying, well, they made a personal decision to go over there, and why are we bringing them into this country? Now, there's hysteria. There's no need to be afraid that they'll spread Ebola among the population. But their attitude is, they made a personal decision, leave them alone. That's hideous. That's ugly. It's horrible. And frankly, I don't give any attention to someone like Ann Coulter because she's just desperately seeking attention. That's all. She doesn't believe anything I think that she says. She just desperately wants attention, and I hope not to ever give it to her. I certainly don't in print or searchable form. I guess it's okay to talk about her, but why would they say such a horrible thing? Well, because again, people listen to that because they're driven by fear. So if we can understand and somehow figure out a way to say to them, there's no need to be frightened. There's no need to be desperate. There's no need to be panicked. Let's talk about what the change is doing. Let's talk about what frightens you and maybe bring you down to earth so that you don't have a tolerant attitude toward the violent, the crazy, the cynical, and the self-promoting. Maybe we just get a little bit further ahead in this insane world we live in. It's just a thought, one to think about. One to ponder. And in other random news, this week scientists made a disturbing discovery in the Arctic Ocean. As the Stockholm University expressed it, they saw, quote, vast methane plumes escaping from the seafloor, end quote. These are plumes of methane. It's a potent greenhouse gas, as our friend Digby writes. It's a potent greenhouse gas that traps heat more powerfully than carbon dioxide, the chief driver of climate change. Now, here's what's especially disturbing about that. Dr. Jason Box, a wise and widely published climatologist, tweeted out the following, and I quote, "If even a small fraction of Arctic seafloor carbon is released to the atmosphere, we're effed." That's F''D. So this scientist believes that we could, as a result of global warming, if this progresses, be completely effed as a planet. That's disturbing. In other random news, a study was done on the nature of the relationship between humans and anthropomorphic robots. And the conclusion, it may be moral to torture a robot because robots are machines. But, quote, the more we regard a robot as a social presence, the more we seem to extend our concepts of right and wrong to our behavior toward them. Close quote. Now, it's an interesting issue because there's nothing morally wrong with torturing, quote unquote, a robot because it has no, or using enhanced interrogation techniques because it has no sensation. On the other hand, I would argue that we do violence to ourselves whenever we enact ritualized violence in any form to anything, human, non-human, or non-living. So I would strongly advise against torturing robots. A nice story, we're always criticizing programmers and brogrammers in the Silicon Valley culture. A nice story, a 13-year-old Google Science Fair finalist has a simple idea to stop cyberbullying. That was the headline in Business Insider. Trisha Prabhu, a 13-year-old from Chicago, won a high spot in the Google Science Fair with a app that could stop cyberbullying, by encouraging people not to not to engage in communication without thinking about it. She has an app called Rethink, which prompts students about to post a mean comment to think about how it might affect its target before posting it. So not every app idea is a bad one. Rethink is a great one, and it comes from a 13-year-old. So that's good news. And lastly, if a monkey takes a selfie, the question all over the internet is who owns the copyright? This came up after Wikipedia decided not to honor a photographer's argument that he owned the rights to a selfie which was taken by a monkey, and it came out great. I guess the monkey took a lot of shots, but one of them came out great. He argued that because it was his camera that the monkey had picked up while he was taking a coffee break or something, that he owned it, but they were arguing that no, he is not the author of the work of art, the monkey. And a lot of, I looked it up, apparently a lot of lawyers agree. The monkey is the author of the work, but the monkey lacks personhood under current law, so the work has no author and is free for anyone to claim. It's a weird country we live in where humans and corporations have personhood, but the species which is closest to us genetically and evolutionarily, which is to say the monkey that took this terrific selfie, does not have personhood. That needs to be fixed, and that's our lesson from Random News for this week. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and I'm here to tell you that as of last week, our long national nightmare is over for the moment. Congress adjourned last week for summer recess after a session which can safely be described as historic. Historic both for historic lack of accomplishment and for the historically low regard in which Congress is now held by the public, according to polls, and thanks to the efforts of the Republican majority. But let's be clear, this shameful record is not an example of what they call, quote-unquote, government failure. It's a demonstration of what happens when people who are opposed to government on reasons of both principle, ideology, and self-interest are in positions of power within government and don't face a sufficiently eloquent and well-organized opposition. Doing nothing isn't a bug for Republicans in Congress. It's a feature. They can now go home proudly declaring they've done nothing and proclaiming omission accomplished. They appear to be evolving, the Republicans that is, from a rhetorically extreme but ultimately self-interested group of people. That's a phenomenon which is morally disturbing, but at least predictable in the political world, into something else altogether, a rhetorically extreme group, some of whom actually believes it's extreme rhetoric. Sooner or later, that will force the GOP's Democratic opponents to confront the question, what do they believe in, and what will they do to achieve it? Traces of the Republican right's steely determination not to let government work are easily found in everything from a xenophobic treatment of refugee children to the austerity policies which continue to ruin our economy. They've even begun to mythologize this destructive behavior, and we'll be getting to that in a moment. But consider the way the House leadership had its own bill, which was only symbolic, scuttled by the ultra-right Ted Cruz wing of its party. That failure left Republicans comically begging the president to do something about the border crisis, and I quote, without the need for congressional action, end quote, at the same time that they were getting ready to sue him for taking other actions without congressional approval. This insanity illustrates the action of a party which lacks both a moral and a cognitive compass. But that doesn't mean that Republicans aren't on a kind of winning streak anyway. The immigration failure was the crowning non-achievement of the closing congressional session, and we're told that it was born one night in Senator Cruz's office over We the Pizza, Starburst, Skittles, Shiner Bock beer, Yingling beer, white wine, and 3 types of Dr. Pepper. I want to know which Republican was the closet elitist who ordered the white wine. And what kind was it? Was it a dry something like a Chardonnay so it could go with the pizza, which is crusty, or perhaps a Riesling, sugary, fruity, to complement the sugary fruitiness of the Skittles? Inquiring minds want to know. But whatever it was and whoever it was, they've proclaimed for the world their know nothing, do nothing, care for nothing, believe in nothing strategy is now the ruling ideology of the Republican Party. children in need, hungry and endangered and far from home, you'd think that would evoke a sympathetic reaction in a kind and generous people. By rejecting these kids at the border and attempting to punish President for what are only acts of common decency towards them, tell us who the Republicans are, not just in their policies and in their souls. Crazy is as crazy does. Will the Democrats stand up to them? Will the Democrats make an economic and political and moral argument that rallies the country around them? No sign of it yet, but there's always hope. In the meantime, how crazy is crazy? Well, we have some audio clips that might let you know. The first is from the Queen of Crazy herself, the outgoing member of Congress from Minnesota, the beloved and sometimes despised and sometimes just source of bafflement and wonderment, Representative Michelle Bachmann had some words this week, and we have an audio clip of her right now. Let's play that clip.
Now, in the United States Senate, the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, has left town. He's left town. Not only did he fail to complete an immigration bill, but he knows full well that President Obama may illegally grant amnesty to 5 to 6 million foreign nationals illegally in the United States without doing anything. What Harry Reid has the opportunity to do is to come back and join us. We'll be here anytime, any day, anywhere, anyhow. We will join him here in August, September, whenever. And he needs to put the other handcuff on this lawless president's hands so that we constrain this president from granting amnesty. That's what the American people want us to do. We do that tonight with this bill. We invite Harry Reid to bring the Senate back and put the handcuff on the president's other hand so that we can have sovereignty again on our southern border. And I yield back to the gentleman from Virginia.
Now, what's mind-blowing about this is that a couple of things. One is that House rules very explicitly state that you are not allowed to describe your political opponents as lawless or law-breaking. They're very explicit on that. But when a Democrat tried to invoke that rule, they were blocked by the Republican majority. So that should have been struck from the congressional record. It was not. Secondly, the image of handcuffs on this president, given the amount of racist rhetoric that's been deployed against them, is to say the least disturbing. But that's our Michelle Bachmann for you. And yet the Republican Party does not expel her as a choking person would expel a piece of a bone in a steak. They should be performing the Heimlich maneuver on themselves and getting these hideous individuals out of their party in the name of decent political discourse, but they don't do it. And that is fascinating. Now we want to pivot to another Republican House member, Justin Amash, who is a libertarian, and say what you will about the libertarians, and I certainly have. There are principled people in their own funny way. Justin Amash was challenged for re-election by Pete Heckstra, who is a lobbyist, whereas the ideological right, which Amash represents, believes in what they're doing. And Heckstra actually, Justin Amash is Arab American. Heckstra ran ads suggesting that Amash was Al-Qaeda's best friend in Congress, or words to this effect. And so when Amash defeated Heckstra, his acceptance speech was not the usual "let's all come together and hold hands" speech. This is Justin Amash accepting his victory in the primary over Pete Heckstra.
I want to say to lobbyist Pete Heckstra, you are a disgrace. And I'm glad we can hand you one more loss before you fade into total obscurity and irrelevance.
You know what? That's good enough. Here's what I love about this, and let's give our props to libertarian right-winger Justin Amash of the Republican Party. Why does everybody pretend when they've been subject to the dirtiest kinds of campaign tricks that they love their opponent. Why do we have to do that? Why don't more Democrats say, my opponent was a lobbyist and representing Wall Street, and I'm glad I took him out? It's just something to think about. I think Justin Amash gave the whole country a little lift with that. And now our last story about Congress before we go to a break is a different one. Elizabeth Loughton, let's go back a second. Representative Stephen Fincher, Republican of Tennessee, has a Twitter account, and the following tweet appeared on Representative Fincher's account, and I quote, "God, I love this song, period, and beach music, period, and shagging." It was with a hashtag Pandora, and it was accompanied by a picture of a Pandora playlist playing the song "I Love Beach Music" by the Embers. Now, you guys may know, I know a lot of music trivia. I didn't even know I love beach music by the Embers, because North Carolina and all the beach music of the South, not the West Coast beach music that everybody knows, Beach Boys and Jan and Dean, they had their own beach music, which was more soul-oriented. But that's going back a ways, even slightly before my time. And I was a little kid, and God, I love this song and beach music and shagging. Well, of course, everybody thinks of Austin Powers. Do I turn you on, baby? But actually, shagging was a dance. People didn't realize this. There was chaos, a lot of embarrassment for Representative Stephen Fincher. Elizabeth Loughton, his communications director, stepped up and said that was meant to be her own tweet on her own account, and she accidentally posted it to her boss's account. She insists, now this is from Politico, they don't believe her. The Politico reporter hasn't been around long enough to realize that shagging is a real thing, and so he says Loughton contacted Pandora to revoke access to the account, and the tweet was automatically deleted. This is, I quote from Politico, "The staffer also insists that quote-unquote shagging was not a sexual reference, but a form of dance. Quote, shagging is dancing to me, and it was no big deal being a North Carolina girl," Loughton said. If you listen to the song, let's listen to this song.
I love beach music. Always have and always will. There ain't no other kind of music in the world that.
So here's the deal. The Embers, by the way, the beach music in the East Coast had a lot of soul influence in it, like this song does. Like, keep the song going. I like this song, but yeah. So I just want to say, by the way, he references here a number of other great, very obscure soul songs, like "Walking Up a One-Way Street" by Willie T. from New Orleans. Most people don't know "Walking Up a One-Way Street," but it's the same kind of groove as this one, kind of shuffle, horn-driven groove. Anyway, the point is this: the song actually references "I love to shag," and the same thing. She's saying she loves to shag, dance on the beach. Stephen Fincher is a Republican. Elizabeth Loughton works for him. I like Elizabeth Loughton. I like her soul. I like the fact that she likes this song. I like the fact she wanted to share it with her friends. It's summertime. It's a time to enjoy dancing on the beach. Only thing is, you got to get your account straight. All right, we're going to turn up the volume on the song and go to break. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
39, 21, 40 shade. What kind of fool do you think I am?
Another great song. What kind of fool do you think I am? The Tams from Atlanta.